Hello and welcome to the Scottish Roadscast, a podcast all about Scotland's roads, bridges and motorways. I'm Stuart.
And I'm John.
John, it's absolutely fantastic to be back here with you on the podcasts.
Absolutely.
I've been absent for quite some time.
You have. I remember some of the last recordings we've done. You had a terrible thing going on with the throat.
Oh God, yes.
And it was, you were going to do more harm than good.
Yes, it was best for me just to stay away, I think, at that point, when you were recording. So it's nice to be back. I hope you were behaving yourselves when I was
Absolutely.
away. Good.
We always do, and we missed you terribly, and I'm sure all the listeners did, so
and
good to have your dulcet tones.
I hope you kept Duncan in check. You can be...
Actually, it was more Duncan keeping me in check, to be
well.
honest. And of course, Duncan's not with us this one. He's almost quite a regular now, so make note of the fact that he's not here to bring his enthusiasm, sadly, but there we go.
Well, that's it. Well, anyway, this month I was very keen that we cover the 60th anniversary of the Forth Road Bridge, which is on the 4th of September 2024. Yep. Obviously 60 years since it was officially opened by Her Majesty the Queen, all those many years and decades ago. And as the regular listeners will know, we do like to mark these big anniversaries.
We do.
So we felt it was worthy of its own episode.
Yeah, I mean, Stuart, we have touched on the Forth Road Bridge, and I mean touched on it in quite a few different podcasts, but never really discussed it in its own right.
It's an interesting topic, right? Because it's such an iconic landmark and so well known by everybody, there is a lot of information online about it already. We, as a sort of group, we tend to focus on the stuff that doesn't get a lot of coverage normally and try and reveal new info. Yeah. So we've kind of held back.
So it's worth listening to this.
Aye. So this will
get our thoughts as well, which
exactly.
Some people might want to know.
Before we get right into it, and most people probably aware by now that we were commissioned to produce the official booklet for the 60th anniversary on behalf of Transport Scotland and the Forth Bridges organisation. So we've done that.
That's a massive privilege.
It is.
Because it's hard act to follow. There's a lot of material about this already, but this booklet's fantastic. It's our biggest one yet.
It is. It's come together very well with a lot of excellent material to include. I should say that all of the photos that we've included in ours are not the type of photos you will see on the Forth Bridges website, anything like that. We very much stuck to private photos from private individuals, engineers and people like that who were involved, so that we offer something with a slightly different flavour to what's already out there. Yeah. And they're on sale on the website now, £6, and you can select your postage option. You're doing us a big favour by buying one in the process because it supports our work and keeps us online.
It does. It's like a donation, but you get something from it.
You get something back in return. So please, if you're interested in the bridge, get on, snap one of them up, we'll get it sent out, and we'll cover a wee bit of detail. Don't propose, like in some of our previous anniversary episodes, to go into a lot of detail because, as I say, it's all out there already. There's nothing new here. Which is a wee bit different to what we.
But can we admit we're both you're a bridges expert, Stuart. I'm not a bridges expert. More with roads, but we don't have a Forth Road Bridge expert with us.
No,
but Forth Road experts have contributed to the booklet. And certainly contributed to our knowledge. Hopefully, makes this insightful.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah. It's an interesting one as well because it's the first of the big anniversaries that we've done where the bridge itself is no longer in use or still being used in the way it was originally intended.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah, but because it is in use, and I do still think it fills a very important role in what it does. But no, it's now for the majority of people making that crossing over the Firth of Forth is on the Queensferry.
Someone made a good point the other evening when I was listening to some discussion about the Forth Road Bridge and its role now, and actually its biggest single role from an overall sort of a strategic point of view is resilience.
Yeah,
it's a resilience if something should happen to the Queensferry crossing. Queensferry crossing is perfect in many ways in terms of its windshieldding and its hard shoulders and its reliability generally as a route.
Yeah,
however,
less maintenance. Yeah.
It has become apparent at times that there are situations when the Queensferry crossing perhaps has to close, and the Forth Road Bridge makes for a nice alternative to that. And it's good that it still has that role.
Yeah, and there's certainly been a lot of work, and we'll talk about this in how they tie in those temporary connections at either side for should that happen.
Yeah. So anyway, today the bridge is officially a public transport corridor. Obviously, pedestrians still can cross the bridge on both sides, as they've always been able to do so.
Non-motorised users.
Yep. Yes. Cycles, buses. There's a lot of buses, the sort of Dunfermline Express services, these sorts of things coming from Fife, and also this Cav Forth automated vehicle trial thing that's on the go as well. We'll mention a wee bit about that as well, because that's all
talk about the future. Absolutely.
Exactly. 'Exactly. Exactly. 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 Right, okay, so I'm going to give you a wee bit of overview of the history first. As I say, we're not going into the depths of the detail here, because you'll find it online pretty easily. But like in most cases, when we go back to Clyde Tunnel, Erskine Bridge, Kingston Bridge, discussions about the need for a crossing at that particular location had been going on for decades before it was actually built. I think even way back in...
Actually, you're looking at, I'd say, centuries in some cases. Because I'm sure you covered, it has always been a crossing, just without the material factor of a bridge.
That's right, because of the width of the estuary there, it is obviously quite difficult, from an engineering sort of point of view to do that. And it was only as technology improved and construction methods modernised that you could start to contemplate, such vast spans and lengths, from one shore to the other. But believe it or not, John, it was actually back in 1740 the first time someone, proposed a bridge across the Firth at that location. Obviously, nothing moved forward than that. There was,
no, we could build bridges, of course, back then, but you're right. It's the distance.
Yeah, there was a second sort of well-documented plan for a bridge in the early 19th century, 1817, in fact, by a James Anderson, an Edinburgh-based civil engineer and a land surveyor. He actually proposed the design for like a chain bridge, which, we've got a few of those in Scotland. Like there's the famous footbridge in Glasgow across the Clyde. It's a chain bridge. There's the Union Bridge, I think, down in the Borders as well. That's obviously another famous chain bridge. There are countless others. Early forms of suspension bridges, basically.
Chain bridge?
Yeah. So it's actually chains, that instead of cables.
Oh, okay. So right. Okay, I see what you mean. Sorry, I was just trying to visualise some of these bridges. Okay, that's fine.
Again, those discussions didn't really go anywhere because as the railway system developed, the sort of the direction of travel there was obviously for rail travel and rail traffic, and it was decided that a railway bridge would be the most appropriate thing to build across the Firth. And as we know, the world famous Forth Rail Bridge was completed in March 1890.
Yes.
Okay. But by the 1920s, road traffic was very much on the increase again, and the levels were getting to such a sort of a place, particularly in the busy summer months, that there were new calls for a road crossing.
Yeah, again, at this time is when people start having cars and lots of things. Yeah.
Exactly. There were a few formal meetings. 1923, 1924, there were several meetings held both in Edinburgh and South Queensferry, and indeed in the House of Commons. And eventually the government, the UK government, put money behind a survey of the Firth of Forth at that location to try and determine which locations would be best suited to the construction of a new second bridge across the Forth there. The railway bridge, it was felt, had snapped up the prime location because of the rocks for foundations and things like that, but they were fairly sure they could find another site, and eventually they sort of settled on the Macintosh Rock, which is one of the wee islands that were in the Firth of Forth at that location.
Okay.
As we've discussed many times, the war got in the way. The economic situation
and the war meant that this couldn't really be taken forward until after that point.
Exactly.
Which traffic was only growing at that point, and as we start to head through the 50s and especially in the early 60s, when things started to generally get better economically, there was definitely the case that this had to happen. But the bridge as we know it, coming into what it is now, the designs and stuff for this were throughout the 50s, and construction actually started in the 50s.
That's right. I mean, at that early stage, back in January 1926, when I said that the UK government put some money behind it, the Ministry of Transport, it was at that stage that the famous engineering consultant Motthay and Anderson came on board as a key partner in the bridge, and they would actually remain with it through its design and completion in 1964. So they had a 40-year association with the structure ultimately, and others across Britain, particularly Severn is another sort of famous one. And ultimately the Severn and Forth Road bridges were designed side by side, and it was decided to progress with Forth first, Severn being a couple of years behind that.
We beat them.
Exactly, we did. We got there just first. In 1935, the case for the bridge was accepted, and at that point, I think they were fairly sure that construction would follow not long after. However, as we mentioned, the war, the economic situation, and various other things got in the way of that. And it was 1947, ultimately, before the Forth Road Bridge Order, approving the construction of the bridge and the establishment of the Forth Road Bridge Joint Board as the Roads Authority progressed. On the back of that, they were still actually thinking about other proposals at that time. And even in 1948, there was still consideration being given to proposals for the addition of a deck to the existing Forth Bridge. A lot of the discussions actually looked at whether they could add a road deck to the Forth Railway Bridge, either above or below or alongside, but ultimately that was all deemed to be fairly infeasible, very difficult to do.
The issue, I think, certainly as I've heard that one too, is that would only be single carriageway.
Yeah.
And there was clearly at the time, as increasing traffic, they wanted to have something that had this capacity, dual carriageway, across to tie in with the approach roads that were going to be either side.
Even by that stage.
I'm glad they didn't go down that line, because it would make things very difficult.
As recently as 1954, which was not long before the start of construction, there was actually proposals put forward for the construction of a tunnel by G.A. Monsell, who was one of the famous consultant engineers as well. Ultimately, they did do the full study and they looked into it, but it was felt that the costs required for the additional operation and maintenance of a tunnel, meant that the bridge was the more economical option. Probably right, to be fair, because tunnels obviously have particular ventilation requirements and fire requirements and all these sorts of things.
They bring their own problems.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of people mention, we'll get more onto the opinion piece of, well, if it was a tunnel, we wouldn't have any other problems with the wind and other things like that. But they are a pain. Tunnels. There's a reason why there's not a lot of them in the UK.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. That's it. Should mention actually going further back again, that a ferry service had operated across the Forth between North and South Queensferry for centuries, since the 1100s, in fact, when it was set up by Queen Margaret, later Saint Margaret. And that's where the name of the two towns actually comes from, Queensferry. And it was given to them, I think it was by actually one of the famous Scottish kings. He appointed that. Sort of gave it that name and allowed it to continue. And it was the Queen's Passage was the name of that ferry service that was operating. Now, they tried to fill the gap. In the early 20th century, as road traffic started to increase, they improved the service to get vehicles across the river fairly quickly. Not as efficient as having a bridge in place, but by let's say last 3 or 4 decades before the bridge opened, there was a fairly efficient ferry service that was running, and it was initially run on 2 diesel-electric ferries, the Robert the Bruce and the Queen Margaret. But a further 2 vessels were later commissioned as well. The Mary Queen of Scots, which could actually carry 500 passengers and 35 vehicles. Yeah. When it came in 1949. And then the Sir William Wallace, which also had a capacity for 500 passengers but could take 40 vehicles. And that was only introduced in 1956. So that's more akin to like the ferries you would see now with that kind of vehicle capacities and stuff. And I just want to comment on just tremendously patriotic names we've managed to get for the names of the ferries. Yeah, very historic, famous Scottish names. The original ferries, those first 2, they could only carry 28 vehicles, but they could still take the 500 passengers. So there was a fairly decent capacity there.
Do we have information on if this could take a lot? Now HGVs back then were smaller. Stuff. Was the ability to take freight and stuff like that? Because I imagine that was one of the big driving forces for a bridge. Was it's not just private cars. That's right. You need to have goods and services. Yeah, I mean the ferries could carry vehicles of up to 11 tons. And trucks at that point, the heaviest trucks would only have been about 22 tons. Yeah. So, so a fair weight was able to be, carried on the ferries. Anything heavier than that would have been sent via Kincardine, though. And as obviously more and more freight was moving to road, it was clear that was just yet more justification for the construction of the bridge. So that also was a driving force there. That ferry service, by the way, was very popular. And by its peak in the early 60s, it was making 40,000 trips across the Forth a year between the 4 of them. They operated at peak times on a frequency of 15 minutes, and they operated 7 days a week. A typical car was charged 4 and 6 to cross, which equates roughly to 22.5 pence in new money. Passengers were charged 7D, 3 pence, which is not a lot. We should really have done the calculation to see what that works out. I'm just trying to think. 70. I thought D would meant pence. I mean, you're obviously old enough, Stuart, to remember the pre-decimal.
Yeah, thanks very much. No, I am not. I'll just clarify that right now. But that was my calculation. Speaking to my father and asking him to help me work out the old pre-decimal coins.
But then what roughly it would equate to maybe now?
Probably a couple of quid. something like that. It won't be much. It won't be much. Probably slightly more maybe than what the toll was when it was removed back in 2008 from the bridge. Anyway, that covers the sort of history in the background in the ferries. Always worth mentioning the ferries because they
always do.
They were very popular, and there were far more of them there than there say were at Erskine or Renfrew or any of these other places where we've covered big
well, because
crossings
there's other crossings and bridges there in place. This is really the only way across apart from Kincardine, because if you were insistent on not using a ferry after the 30s, when Kincardine was built, you'd have to go via Kincardine.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of the sort of approval then for the bridge came in the late 40s, as we said, when the board was set up. Motthay and Anderson were retained, but they also brought on Freeman Fox and partners, who regular listeners will recall were involved in some of the other big bridges in Scotland, particularly Erskine Bridge.
Yeah.
They were very well known for very lightweight structures, metal structures, very efficient, modern, new style, like steel box girder bridges, things like that. Very efficient use of material means you could cross large spans fairly cheaply.
Yes.
Whereas, 10, 20, 30 years before...
Using modern methods as well. Yeah.
It would have been very heavy, very expensive, but as technology was improving and things were being refined, it was far easier to do these things, and Freeman Fox were very, very well known for that. And, John, looking at some of the records and things, it's pretty clear from the outset that the suspension bridge option probably was the best option.
Best at the time.
Location. At the time, with the technology available. The Americans already done a few. They had refined the technology. After the Tacoma Narrows failure, the famous one over there that collapsed, there was a lot more understanding of wind tunnelling effect and all these things that happen in poor weather. So by the time the Forth Bridge came along, these things had all been sort of bottomed out, and they could construct it with much more confidence.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's what you require. A few stats. Duncan loves reading off stats, doesn't he? From sheets
well, you
of
can
paper.
pretend to be Duncan.
Yeah, I don't want to steal his thunder on these.
He loves to do this, but yeah,
yeah. But there's one or two things that are probably worth mentioning. So the main span is 1,006 metres, which is quite long. That's out across the river. Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Did you know now though that the biggest, the longest in the world, and I actually should thank Robert McCulloch for this, who works on the bridge and is an expert on it, and he was talking about it the
I
other
can
day.
attest that Robert actually is an expert. I worked with Robert for a few years, and he is fantastic.
He was telling us that I think the longest span currently in use in the world is something like 2,000 metres, like over 2 kilometres. And there's actually one proposed for somewhere in the world that if it actually ever happens, it would be over 3,000 metres, of a single main span, which is just phenomenal.
Which is huge, 3 kilometres or something.
Massive. The two main towers are 156 metres tall, and there are two side spans, each of 408 metres as well. The two approach viaducts are fairly significant structures as well. 252 metres long in the north, 438 metres long in the south, and they are comprised of box girders.
Yeah,
they are separate to the main structure. And combined, the bridge is over 2.5 kilometres long, so over about a mile and a half long, say, or thereabouts. And the bridge has two running lanes in each direction, a combined pedestrian and cycleway. So that was what they wanted from the outset.
Was to have this, but interestingly, the detail on like the cycleways and so on, these are outriggers essentially that are the best way to think of it is like bolted onto the side of it. They you can put vehicles on them, but they're not designed as running roadways, if you know what I mean. The
Forth Road Bridge is the only one from that sort of second half of the 20th century era that is a truss deck. All the others, like Severn, Humber, for example, they are steel box girders for decks, whereas Forth is actually a proper truss. And again, that allows wind and things like that to move through fairly easily. The steel box girders are a bit more aerodynamic.
Yeah, so, the truss, it can lead to some other problems, famously. So
Exactly, yeah.
With these things, but no, it's an interesting story. But I came out, but sticking with suspension bridges, just a take here with these. The reason why didn't you just do something where you have a whole lot of piers and columns going in? But that's incredibly expensive, also in its depth. And the suspension bridge is really a case of this was chosen because of the distance
Yep.
that it had to traverse going over the Firth of Forth.
And also
you only need
maintaining
the towers.
the clearance as well for shipping.
For
to
shipping,
the
yeah,
shipyard.
yeah, you're right. If
Yep.
you have something low lying in some way, so it's a good technology. Basically, yeah, you're holding it up.
As opposed, say, to the Tay Road Bridge, for example.
Yes,
That could be built in the channel.
So my thing there is just why. You
Yeah.
know, did we pick that over something else?
Exactly. I guess the main feature of any suspension bridge is the main cables.
Yes.
A few facts about them. There are two main cables, as anybody who's used the bridge will know, one on either side of the towers, either side of the deck. They are hung 590mm in diameter, so as a circle. Each is made up of 11,618 high tensile wires, each of which has a 4.98mm diameter.
So the cable is actually consistent of all these smaller...
Thousands of small ones
That's
compressed
right.
together.
You can see this if you go into the Forth Bridges building. They've
As
got
an
a
example,
demonstration of
a
it.
slice, yeah, a
slice,
cross-section of one that you can see. that's
Super
worth,
interesting.
It is worth looking at. Yeah, so they compressed these down to 590mm. They painted them with a paste, covered them over, and then used clamps and things and covered it over. And, you know, the operation to construct that went on day and night for months and months and months and months when they were pulling it all together. All very, very, very interesting. The deck itself is made up of a steel stiffening truss, as we mentioned, with 3 longitudinal air gaps at roadway level to improve aerodynamic stability. So that's like your gap between the footway, the deck, and the centre reservation, and then the other two on the other side.
Yeah.
The cables are anchored at each end, and they can actually take loads of up to 13,800 tonnes in each, and they're anchored into rock. And anybody ever does the door open days visit to the Forth Road Bridge, you will actually get a trip into the anchorage chamber where you can see where the cables are actually anchored into the ground, and it's fascinating to see.
It is. It's a strange thing, but it's absolutely fascinating. But that is where the muscle is, really, of that structure.
You're absolutely right. And there's a photo in the booklet that actually shows 2 guys standing at the mouth of the tunnel of the anchorage chamber, and it just puts them into perspective because, in fact, you've just passed it there, John, the page before that on the left. You'll see these 2 chaps are standing, and they look tiny compared to the opening of this tunnel, and these cables go right down in there, and that was then flooded with concrete, you know, just to hold the whole thing in place. It's phenomenal. It really is.
Yeah,
It really is. Suspension bridges obviously have a lot of hanger ropes and things like that as well. They could take, you know, loads of like 176 to 225 tons each. You know, so there is a fair capacity in them. You know, big beefy bits of wire rope here.
Yeah. So to put people in the picture, you get the main cables that come up from these anchorages, go looping over the towers, a bit like a washing line.
Yeah.
Right, and the hangers are your pegs.
Yep.
Basically, is the way I think of it, as that come down.
Basically, yeah.
Done my best to describe that with a diagram.
Yeah. In terms of the construction, I mean, it was a huge challenge. I mean, there was no one contractor in Britain that would have been able to handle that. And like at Severn, like at Humber, 3 of the country's biggest contractors came together. Sir William Arrow Company, the Cleveland Bridge and Engineering Company, and Dorman Long Bridge and Engineering. They came together and formed the ACD Bridge Company to build the bridge. And they were given the contract to do so in 1957.
Yeah.
All right. At that point, it was estimated that the work would cost around £19.5 million, which would include the approach roads north and south.
Yeah.
Which works at roughly £350 million to £400 million today. So still a fairly big sum.
Yeah. Obviously, it would cost a lot. I always say this.
Yeah.
Obviously, would cost a lot more now, given all the extra steps.
Yeah. Queensferry Crossing was what, £750 million in the end up, just for the bridge.
I thought it was about $1 billion.
I think that was the entire cost.
Right. Okay.
The
Of all the
bridge,
roads and everything, and the
all the
ITS
various
and
bits and
everything.
bobs that came with it. Yeah. So you know, so you're right. Things are more expensive now, typically. But given that value, it was still the largest single infrastructure project undertaken in Scotland during either the 1950s or 60s. You know, it was a massive.
Oh yeah, there's nothing else on that scale.
Yeah. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the construction, but it commenced fairly rapidly. They got on with it. The first year or so really involved work on the sort of the foundations, the main towers, the cable anchorages. That was all started by late 1958 and completed on schedule by 1960. Work then focused on the sort of completion of the towers as they gradually rose, you know, from the river up. When that was all completed, they then built the approach side towers and the approach viaduct supports and all that as well. Yeah. And then ultimately the third major item was the construction of the cables and getting them put in place. And as we mentioned earlier, those cables are, you know, they're big. They comprise more than 30,000 miles of wire. and put together over 2 shifts working, basically 8 until midnight, almost 24 hours a day.
More wire to wrap around the planet several times there.
Exactly, yes, mentioned in the booklet. The first 4 wires were actually hauled over the tops of the towers in November 1961, and that work then proceeded for a couple of years as well. Some of these catwalks that the men and the steel erectors were working on were like 500 feet, above the river.
Yeah.
Scary stuff, and there was little health and safety there. They did have safety nets, they did have rescue boats and things. But
I've even seen hard hats and some of the
there
old
were
pictures.
some hard hats, but still, in terms of what we expect as a modern health and safety sort of environment, it's certainly nowhere near that.
Yeah, it's very different.
And there were 7 fatalities during the construction of the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
There were 4 fatalities on the bridge itself and 3 on the North Approach
Road, where Marston Road collapsed.
The cables were completed late 1962, and following that, the steel hangers and then eventually the deck work began. Over 15,000 tonnes of steel work ultimately required and fabricated in Glasgow, Darlington and Middlesbrough. Every tonne of that steel was British.
Mm-hmm.
Changed days.
But it was different because Britain was industrialised back then to a degree. So yeah.
Oh, yeah. I know. I guess we probably should mention the approach roads as well, because a lot of people don't realise that Scotland's first motorways were built as part of the.
I was going to say, this is if we're going to turn this back into a roads podcast now.
Yeah.
That's right. So the M90 and what form? This is on the north of the M90, and what forms part of the A823M, which is a motorway in its own right, opened at the same time as the Ashworth Road Bridge in September 1964, and they are the first motorways in Scotland. To the south, it was the A90, which actually went towards Edinburgh. Now, we've got to put ourselves in the picture of the rest of the motorway network at this point. It wasn't there.
It wasn't there.
The following year, I think like the Hart Hill bypass opened and other things, but the motorway network didn't really start to come into its form until late 60s, 70s.
You're absolutely right. By the time the construction started on the bridge, they had a rough idea of what they would like to do, but they had no real detail.
Nothing was on the ground.
It was by the early 60s that the detail of how the motorway system would tie in with what was being built. And, that's the single reason why there was no direct connection from the M9 to the Forth Road Bridge for the first 40-odd years of its existence. Yeah. Because the bridge came first, and then the M9 and all these other parts all came as separate things, When the bridge was built, the main south approach was always felt to be the A90, because that was the main link.
You're going to Edinburgh, and you'd go through Edinburgh that way, it didn't kind of join up. And there are criticisms of this and that. But no, back to the approach roads, there was a huge undertaking in getting these in, because it was, do you know, at the north end, at that area around there, there's rock cuttings and everything that had to go through. There was an old railway line that went through the North Pier branch line, went underneath at that part. So there was a tunnel there that had to be capped off in those areas that eventually has been filled in subsequent years. The approach roads were significant. Masterton has its own viaduct as well, the large Masterton viaduct, which is at the junction 2 of the M90.
And we've actually, in the booklet, we've included a map at the end that shows you all the roads that were built as part of the contract, and we've even indicated the line that was originally planned for the East Fife Regional Road there as well, just because Masterton obviously is one of these junctions that was supposed to be way bigger than it ever ended up.
Masterton would have ended up looking like Hamilton. Yeah. Right, is a good way to put it. But they decided later on, actually, the East Fife Regional Road will become the A92, which will go from Halbeath. So that's why it's left in the form it's in. Yeah. That's it. But
our old friends, some of the contractors that were involved in these approach roads, so Wattlings were involved.
You beat me to it. I was going to say that.
You'll have that there. Wattlings were involved, and AM Carmichael as well, who were one of the early contractors involved in sort of roads and new roads in Scotland at that time. They eventually they went out of business during the construction of the M9 and the M8 round about Newbridge, I believe, but they were also involved.
They've done the south. Yes, they did. I'm just going by memory, so I'm looking about
Carmichael in the south, Wattlings in the north. Extensive works. A lot of new roads built as part of the bridge, and I know at times that they did wonder whether they should be doing it at the same time. But I think ultimately it was more successful by adequately tying it into the existing road network and allowing it to then be incorporated within the proposed road network as well.
Now, these road networks, as we say, these were, especially in the north, limited access roads for the motorway. But then, of course, the bridge itself, interestingly, not motorway.
I know, yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I'm hoping you'll know.
Well, the reason is with a lot of crossings why you find it, and the same with the M25, and it becomes the was it 228 or whatever it is, Dartford, is the reason is as soon as you put motorway, you restrict traffic.
Mm-hmm.
But with, I think, things like the Forth Road Bridge, it's felt that agricultural traffic and other things and stuff should still be allowed to get across the bridge. Because otherwise, if you do this, you have to provide an alternative for these things. Yeah. So crossings and the like generally stay all purpose, unless there is another route that's suitable with that one. So the motorway actually stopped short of it. The motorway finished at Admiralty Junction, which is now Junction 1C.
That's right, and continued north of various parts of the M90 that came on
so it was A90 going over the bridge to specify that. But very fitting roads for this wonderful new suspension bridge. I mean, this was back in the time of Scotland is entering its motorway age. They wanted all these things, so very fitting roads for this new crossing.
And on opening day, it was a big event. They got the Queen and Prince Philip to come along and open it, and she travelled up to the bridge and opened it and travelled across in the sort of royal convoy of vehicles.
Some terrific pictures of this.
Then down to North Queensferry, and I believe came back on the ferry, and then in the afternoon went into Edinburgh to listen to a concert that had been specifically prepared to celebrate the opening of the Forth Road Bridge, where all the dignitaries and special guests went along to see it. Fantasia, I think it was Scottish Fantasia or something it was called. We've got some copies of some of the invitations and things now in the archive as well, so it's all very fascinating. Yeah, with
those things. It's just a shame we didn't have such, all that fanfare when they opened like the Maybole bypass. Was there a musical and a concert for the A77s?
No. Thankfully not.
We don't make much of a spectacle of such things these days, though. But fair enough.
And a sign of things to come, the bridge was immediately popular on opening, and at one point it was taking between 5,000 and 6,000 vehicles every hour. At one point, it was struggling to cope. Now that only continued, I'm afraid, during the opening sort of years and early years of the bridge, because traffic growth shot up. It was a very convenient link. People wanted to use it, obviously.
Yeah, you'll get this problem. Reduce traffic, they'll come out and say this, but I suppose it creates an opportunity for them people who live in Fife to go and work. Yeah. Well, I can get across the bridge now. Yeah. It was a tremendous faff before. So yeah, it's allowed. You've created a journey option. Yeah.
It's fair to say the bridge has had some issues in its history, which is why we now have the Queensferry crossing. Obviously, vehicle loadings went up. That increased the strain in it. At one point, at its peak, it was carrying something like 24 million vehicles a year when it was designed for 12 million vehicles a year. The conditions in which the bridge operated in as well, that marine environment, they discovered that there was some potential issues with some of the cables and things, which they then brought in a dehumidification treatment, which actually stopped a lot of that. And I think it ended up not ever being quite as bad as they thought. But at one point, there was a worry that the bridge would have to close to heavy vehicles, which led to the development of the Queensferry crossing. Yeah. Even by the 1980s, it was a very congested crossing, the whole corridor round about it. That had led to studies looking at a second crossing, the setting forth studies.
The setting forth study looked at, and which actually got canned, but elements of it went into what they call the fourth replacement crossing, which led to Queensferry crossing.
I think the original plan in the early 1990s was that the old bridge would be used for southbound traffic, a new bridge would be used for northbound traffic. You would have this immense gyratory. There would have been widening of the motorway to the north, and
it was one of the options. They did want to toll the new bridge as well, and that's right. There was a lot of plans for tying it properly in with the M9 and having kind of 3-lane widening all the way up to Albeath.
Yeah, some fascinating studies there. We've got a lot of that in the archive as well. Worth a look. We'll need to get some of it online.
And there is, and you're right. We've got all the copies of these things. But
and then ultimately, I guess, we should also mention that brief period in 2015 where a specific element of the truss
end link
failed rather spectacularly and led to the bridge being closed for a couple of weeks. It was open to cars and things and light vehicles very quickly, but heavies, I think it was the February the following year before it ultimately reopened, and that obviously put a lot of pressure on it.
There's our friend Robert who was in the thick of that and discovered that. Yeah. And I had only just started working there. Some of the long-time listeners know that I actually worked not on that contract with maintaining it. I wasn't involved in the bridge per se, but more dealing with the maintenance of the approach roads. And I was in that job maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and that happened.
It kicked off and caused all sorts of troubles. It all seems so long ago now, but it was a big thing at the time.
We've been 10 years anniversary since that, but we got it sorted.
Yeah,
there was a lot of figuring out how to get that done. But I remember the diversion routes that had to be set up to get everything round via Kincardine and everything.
So, I mean, since August 2017, the Queensferry Crossing's been the main route for traffic across the Firth there. So it's a much quieter bridge. That has allowed them to do a lot of maintenance work that previously would have been very disruptive to traffic.
Well, they've replaced the DMAGs, which are the big expansion joints. So
the expansion joints have been done. There's I know there's a bit of painting going on. There's other planned works coming up as well. So they're now able to do a lot of this without the worry, about disruption to traffic. Meanwhile, the bridge does still have a function as a public transport corridor. And since the spring last year, May 23, it's been operating this autonomous vehicle, this CAV4 service, which is 5 autonomous 42-seater buses built by Alexander Dennis up in Falkirk. I believe they're electric as well, or hybrid, something like that. And they run a 14-mile link between Inverkeithing and Edinburgh Park at Hermiston. And they're automated. There is still a driver, but the bus is basically driving itself. And it makes use of the bus lanes, the bus lane hard shoulders on the M90 and the M9 and the M8 to get quickly between the two destinations. So it's still very involved in that. It has the capability of carrying thousands of passengers a week, apparently. All going well. So it does
need to go on that,
function. Yeah, I need to get a ride on that. And it's still a nice place to go and walk the bridge. It's nice to go out and walk across. And I think it's better now because it's so quiet.
It is. I remember when Queensferry Crossing opened. So I obviously worked there in that building, and it was incredibly loud, the place. The tolls were gone at that point, but it was very loud. And then when everything was on Queensferry, the place was eerie. Yeah. It was strange. It's almost like walking around a shopping centre that's closed, that's bustling during the day, and then suddenly closed. And that's what it was like. Yeah.
That's our Whirlwind tour, Whistle Stop tour.
Whistle Stop Whirlwind tour
of the Forth Road Bridge.
And all the things. So now, I suppose, you're right. You're saying that a lot less is on it. There's a lot less loading on the bridge. It's important that buses and taxis and pedestrians get across, but it has allowed a lot of maintenance to happen. Yeah. One particular thing I mentioned about DMAGs, you're a bridge guy, Stuart, expansion joints in and out. Have you ever been able to have an expansion joint that you're practically able to walk through?
No, particularly large, and I think they can take movement ranges of something like nearly 2 meters through there because it's a huge structure.
There's some of the coolest things you can see. Yeah. There's those things and the work that's been done, very complicated projects that to replace these bespoke type expansion joints to allow the movement in that bridge, because there was a lot of movement in it. Could only happen once traffic was off it. Yeah. So.
No, it's an interesting one. It's going to be there for decades to come. It's well looked after. It still has a role. You never know. It might even take more traffic at points and down the line. I mean, now, for example, if Queensferry Crossing has to close for any reason, whether it's the issue with ice on the cables or any of these well-documented things, traffic now can switch over to Forth Road Bridge automatically. They've got these new speed barriers that were installed north and south.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So again, I just sound like one of these old people who's reminiscing all the time here, but I suppose that's what I'm so sore. But I remember they had temporary tie-ins that they sought to construct, but they couldn't be implemented quickly. Yeah. That's right. And in recent years, I know that, Bear, who look after the bridge, have put these projects forward now, so it's much quicker to get these across. And it's basically a form of varioguard. Yeah. You can just wheel it across, almost on casters, and then everyone can use it. And they have tested this, haven't they? So
and there's another big test coming up apparently in November this year.
So that's your chance to go over the old bridge.
To drive over the old bridge, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Go and see it. But, I have some fond memories of being there.
Yeah, so happy 60th birthday, Forth Road Bridge.
Happy 60th. Yeah, indeed.
Here's to another 60. And I hope you've enjoyed that one. It was a fairly brief tour, as I say, of the history of the bridge.
Do you know, the thing is that it is, rather than being a big reading of all the stats and all the things like that, it's all there in the booklet. It's in obviously our website as well, with these sorts of materials. And it's not to discredit our efforts of getting together to do this podcast today, it is best almost to learn about this from that resource, because you get the diagrams, the pictures, and everything that's with it. I don't know if you've got any kind of closing thoughts on the Forthright Bridge.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed using it. I used to like going through to the viewpoint because it's got the stunning viewpoint at the south side where you can look right across.
Yes,
it
does have that.
Where else in the world can you go and have three such iconic structures side by side and be able to get such a good view of them? You know?
Well, you do. Some of the Glasgow gantries, you can see them. They are structures, and you can see them from some great viewpoints. So you can see multiple ones in there, and they are beautiful in their own right.
I'm sure lots of people would agree with that. Yeah, but you know what I mean. It's
Just glad I worked gantries into this one. So
it's a very interesting location. I think it's worthwhile. I would like to express our thanks to Douglas Strachan. Douglas was involved in the construction of the bridge, and he now lives in Humber, having been involved in Humber Bridge. He was also involved in Erskine Bridge construction. He allowed us access to some of his archive material, and some of the new photos and some of the diagrams and things we've found recently have come through that. So thank you to Douglas for allowing us access. Much appreciated, and very nice to see you again, Douglas, at the official events.
Thank you
as well. So yes, all good.
And we should thank Robert McCulloch as well for some of his information.
Always.
That Robert's obviously a member of the archive and as actually still works and knows everything about the bridge. These things, he's provided a lot of knowledge to us, and he's always a good chance to catch up with him about contemporary things happening with the bridge as well.
Oh, completely. Yeah.
A bit of a mention to him too.
Yeah.
So.
In terms of future podcasts, you've got an interesting one coming up with a surfacing expert, I believe.
Yes, I do. We're going to get an expert back in the room. You might think, well, that surely is going to be Duncan. Well, we found somebody who's an even bigger expert than Duncan. So yes, we're going to talk all about road surfacing and the different materials that you get with that, the process behind maintaining all these things. It's going to be great. I'm not going to spoil it. It's going to be great.
That'll be very interesting. Yeah. All the previous episodes are still available, as you know, on the usual podcasting providers. Yep. Please look us up. Please leave us a review. It's always great to hear from you.
And don't forget about social media. Always mention this, but I'm hoping people who are listening to this also look at these things. But don't forget, you can see us on all the usual channels: Facebook, X, some stuff on Instagram as well.
Indeed, and we will be at the Bridgeton Bus Garage open weekend in October. If you want to come and say hi, come and see us. And John, you and Duncan will be at the Forth Road Bridge doors open days at the end of September as well. So on the back of this podcast, a very interesting day out there. There's minibus tours and things to various parts of the bridge. Could be worth coming.
Does that mean anybody who's listening to this podcast who has a problem with it is going to come up to me and say,
so.
"By the way, John, you didn't cover this, or you didn't mention this"? Well, that's my cross to bear. So please come up and say hi.
Yeah, come up and say hi. And we will see you again all very soon.
Yes, you will. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.